I had always thought that money could solve everything. Growing up in Moscow, surrounded by marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a family who could buy an entire street if they wanted, I believed the world operated on contracts, accounts, and calculated decisions. Everything, even human emotion, seemed transactional. I never imagined that a small, sun-kissed barangay in the Philippines could challenge all of that. Or that I, a woman who spent her childhood in frost-bitten winters, would feel an unfamiliar warmth far stronger than any heater back home. I arrived in Manila with a vision. I wanted to open a small boutique hotel, something elegant, something European that could attract high-paying tourists seeking luxury in the tropics. I had already invested a small fortune, hired staff, and envisioned a seamless operation. The property was beautiful, whitewashed walls, tropical gardens, and a pool glinting like liquid sapphire under the sun. I thought I understood hospitality because I had traveled extensively. But nothing prepared me for the people who lived around my project. My first hires were Filipino women, young, vibrant, and polite beyond what I thought possible. I had interviewed them meticulously, asking questions that reflected efficiency, past experience, and attention to detail. But on the first day, I found myself irritated. Tasks were done with pauses, questions, and sometimes laughter in between. When I asked one woman to prepare the linens, she smiled and chatted with a neighbor for several minutes before starting. I frowned. In Russia, pauses like this were unacceptable. Deadlines were non-negotiable. Here, it felt like chaos, inefficiency, or worse, indifference. I made a decision that, in hindsight, was impulsive but reflective of my old worldview. I fired them. One by one, the young women bowed politely, whispered "Salamat po" with timid smiles, and left. I felt satisfaction for about 5 minutes before a sinking feeling started in my chest. It was unsettling, this combination of triumph and emptiness. I told myself I was doing what any serious businesswoman would do, but the universe, it seems, has a sense of humor. Or perhaps the universe has a way of teaching empathy that money cannot buy. The following morning, I was greeted not by silence, but by a small crowd. Women I had fired, neighbors, and curious children stood by the entrance of my hotel property. They had come not to demand my head, nor to protest in anger, but to offer me a welcome I had never expected. One elderly woman, stooped with age but radiating quiet authority, stepped forward. She carried a basket of fresh mangoes, still sticky with morning dew, and placed it on my desk. "Welcome, miss," she said softly. "We will help you." I blinked. This was not the reaction I had anticipated. In Moscow, if you fired someone, they either cursed you quietly or reported you to the authorities. Here, the people I dismissed were offering me kindness. Their generosity made no logical sense, at least not the kind of sense my Western mind had been trained to trust. Over the next week, I observed the rhythm of the barangay, their subtle rituals, and the unseen bonds that tied them together. I noticed how neighbors shared food, how children ran errands for elders without hesitation, how the community operated like an organism rather than isolated individuals. If someone fell sick, everyone contributed. If a family had a celebration, the entire barangay pitched in. It was chaos to my trained, orderly eye, but it was also astonishingly efficient in a way I had never encountered. I began to feel a sense of unease. I had always believed that authority came from wealth, titles, or influence. Here, authority came from respect, earned through kindness, cooperation, and shared responsibility. I started questioning every decision I had made, from the firing of my staff to the rigid schedules I imposed. For the first time in my life, I realized that success could not be dictated by money alone. Curiosity and guilt drew me outside the walls of my boutique hotel. I walked through narrow streets lined with colorful houses, barking dogs, and vendors selling fruit and street food. Children waved at me with wide, innocent smiles, and mothers nodded politely, offering the occasional, "Good morning, miss." I realized that I had never felt this seen, this acknowledged in Moscow. There, recognition often came with hidden agendas, favors, or calculation. Here, it was pure, unfiltered acknowledgement of presence. One afternoon, I decided to visit a family whose children had often played outside my property. They welcomed me into their small home, which smelled of cooking rice and grilled fish. The walls were adorned with simple decorations, photographs, calendars, and hand-painted religious icons. They offered me rice cakes and a local sweet drink. I hesitated at first, thinking it a courtesy for strangers, a calculated act. But when I tasted the food, the warmth of the home, and the laughter shared between siblings, I realized that it was genuine. They wanted to share their lives with me, not because they expected payment, not because they wanted to impress me, but because it was natural, human, Filipino. Returning to my boutique hotel, I began to reconsider everything. The way I had approached staff management, the cold efficiency I believed in, and the rigid hierarchies of my world now seemed hollow. I began reaching out to my former staff, apologizing in awkward Russian phrases mixed with the little Tagalog I had learned. Pasensya na po, sorry. I want you help again? I stammered. Their laughter at my clumsy pronunciation was not mocking. It was accepting forgiving. They returned, not just as employees, but as willing collaborators, offering advice on local suppliers, customs, and even simple ways to make the hotel more welcoming. It was during this period of humility and observation that I first noticed something extraordinary about Filipino culture, the concept of Bayanihan. I had read about it before, community spirit, mutual help, but to witness it was entirely different. I watched as neighbors helped an elderly man repair a damaged roof without asking for money, as children gathered fallen coconuts for free distribution, and as families pitched in to clean communal spaces. There was no recognition required, no external reward. The action itself carried inherent value, a currency more potent than money. I began experimenting, trying to emulate this in my boutique hotel. I organized small events where the barangay could contribute ideas, share talents, and even cook local dishes for guests. Initially, I felt like a novice, unsure of boundaries and protocol. But as weeks passed, I noticed a subtle shift in my understanding of leadership. Leading was no longer about imposing rules or punishing inefficiency. It was about creating space for others to shine, offering guidance without control, and, most importantly, acknowledging that wealth alone does not make a person valuable. There was one moment that stayed with me forever. A typhoon warning was issued, and I rushed to ensure the hotel was secure. Electricity flickered, the wind rattled the windows, and I panicked in a way I had never before. Yet my staff, many of whom I had fired initially, stood calm, guiding guests to safety, preparing food, securing furniture, and coordinating with neighbors. I realized then that authority, respect, and loyalty were earned through trust and care, not fear or money. The contrast hit me harder than any winter storm in Moscow. In Russia, storms demanded preparation and control. Here, storms demanded cooperation, resilience, and collective ingenuity. The wealth I had brought could not shield me, my control could not protect me, but the human network I had once dismissed as chaotic saved the day. That evening, after the typhoon passed, the barangay gathered outside my hotel. Children were soaked, elders were tired, but everyone smiled. I stood silently, trying to articulate my gratitude, and failed. Words seemed inadequate. Instead, I offered fruit from my garden, small tokens of appreciation, and awkward hugs. They accepted it all with laughter and warmth, not because it mattered, but because it was the right thing to do. For the first time, I understood that empathy could not be calculated, generosity could not be quantified, and leadership could not exist in a vacuum. My boutique hotel remained unfinished in the traditional sense, yet it became something far more valuable, a space of connection, humility, and shared humanity. As I sat that night, watching the moonlight filter through palm leaves onto the white walls of my property, I realized something profound. I had come to the Philippines to create comfort and elegance for tourists. Instead, the country had created something for me, an education in humility, in trust, in human warmth, and in the immeasurable value of community. I went to bed that night feeling lighter than I had in decades. The next morning, I knew I would not make the same mistakes again. I would never underestimate kindness, patience, or the wisdom embedded in culture, no matter how foreign it seemed. I had come as a wealthy Russian woman who thought she understood the world, and I was beginning to leave as someone far richer, not in money but in insight, compassion, and love for people I had once deemed inefficient, and this was only the beginning. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, I felt the invisible threads of the barangay weaving themselves into my life. Tasks that had once seemed mundane became rituals of connection. I discovered that the people I had once dismissed as inefficient possessed a rhythm and wisdom that no formal training could teach. The young women I had fired and rehired now guided me, showing how to buy fresh seafood at the market before the sun was fully awake, which vendors offered the best mangoes, and how to greet elders so that they felt honored, not patronized. I watched them work with a sort of quiet pride I had never witnessed in Moscow. It was not about speed, money, or accolades. It was about doing the right thing in the right way. Their joy in small achievements, in helping each other, in sharing moments, was alien to me at first, but it was intoxicating. I realized that I had been living in a world where efficiency had replaced empathy and productivity had replaced connection. Here, life moved slower, but every gesture carried weight. Every smile mattered. Running the boutique hotel remained a challenge. I had imagined perfection, polished floors, crisp linens, smiling staff, but reality refused to bend. Electricity flickered unpredictably, plumbing was erratic, and the tropical rains threatened to flood the gardens. I spent evenings hunched over blueprints, worried about supply chains, staffing schedules, and financial projections. Yet, in the midst of these frustrations, I began to see something remarkable. My staff did not merely follow instructions, they anticipated problems before I did. They repaired leaks, reorganized rooms, and even comforted guests in ways that no manual could teach. One afternoon, I watched a small boy fall into the pool while his mother was distracted. I froze, but before I could move, one of my staff members dove in and lifted him to safety, laughing as the frightened mother gasped. It was instinctive, natural. I realized then that leadership was not about giving orders. It was about trusting the people around you to act with intelligence, heart, and courage. I also began learning Filipino values firsthand. The concept of utang na loob, the deep unspoken obligation of gratitude and reciprocity, became clear in everyday interactions. When a neighbor offered help, they did not expect repayment immediately. Instead, a bond was formed, a silent understanding that kindness would ripple forward. I started practicing it myself, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I began cooking small meals for my staff, bringing fresh fruits from the garden to neighbors, and even learning how to join in their karaoke sessions, my voice shaky but sincere. There were humorous moments, of course. I struggled with the language, often mixing Russian, English, and the little Tagalog I could manage. Once, while trying to order lunch for the staff, I asked for fried rice with chicken, but somehow it came out as chicken with fried mangoes. We all laughed, and the mistake became a running joke for weeks. I began to realize that mistakes were not failures here. They were invitations to connect, to laugh, to learn. Integration into the barangay also meant participating in their celebrations. I was invited to a baptism, a fiesta, and even a wedding. Each event revealed layers of generosity, humor, and emotional depth I had never seen before. At one wedding, I watched the entire community contribute to the feast. Neighbors brought dishes, children ran errands, elders blessed the couple, and even I was asked to help decorate. I hesitated at first, unsure of my place. But when I saw their smiles, their laughter, and the joy in collective effort, I realized I had already been adopted into something far greater than a staff hierarchy, a family without blood ties. Managing the boutique hotel also tested me financially and emotionally. I was used to handling wealth like a shield, assuming that money could solve delays, shortages, or dissatisfaction. But here, money had limits. Guests often preferred rooms that were humble but clean, serviced by staff who smiled genuinely rather than those who executed orders robotically. I had to recalibrate my expectations. Luxury could exist, but only if it was combined with heart, community, and authenticity. I began incorporating local traditions into the hotel. Fresh flowers from the market every morning, handmade decorations, local cuisine, and even hosting small cultural performances by barangay members for tourists. The result was transformative. The boutique hotel became less of a transactional business and more of a living space infused with culture, connection, and warmth. Then came the moment that truly tested my transformation. A typhoon approached the region, stronger than any forecast had predicted. Electricity went out, rain poured in sheets, and the wind threatened to uproot palm trees. My instinct was to panic, to demand absolute order, to control every movement of my staff. But the women I had once fired acted with calm, decisive leadership. They organized guest safety, secured belongings, and even coordinated with neighboring families to ensure no one was left stranded. I stood silently, absorbing the scene, and realized that my concept of control was shallow. True leadership here meant trust, collaboration, and courage. After the storm passed, I walked among the families who had helped. Homes were damaged, gardens flooded, and yet no one complained. Instead, they laughed, shared food, and helped repair each other's homes. I felt a mixture of awe and shame. How little I had understood the power of community until now. Money could not rebuild homes. Empathy, patience, and human connection could. I started documenting these lessons, writing reflections in my journal each evening. I wrote about empathy as a daily practice, humility as a leadership tool, and generosity as a currency more valuable than gold. I noted that wealth could open doors, but it could not build trust. I realized that the boutique hotel had become an experiment not in luxury, but in human connection. Every guest, every staff member, every neighbor became a teacher. Over time, I also noticed subtle shifts within myself. My gaze softened. I smiled more freely. I listened before speaking. I began to find joy in small gestures: a child's laughter, a neighbor's greeting, a freshly cooked meal shared among strangers who had become friends. I realized that the rigid structure I had once idolized was insufficient for the depth of life I now craved. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it complete. I still struggled with impatience, the remnants of my old worldview. I still occasionally measured efficiency in ways that seemed logical to my Russian upbringing. But now I saw the folly of insisting on control over people's hearts. I learned to respect timing, patience, and the invisible flow of community. My staff no longer worked for fear of reprimand. They worked because they trusted me, and I trusted them. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant humility, attention, and openness. I began to hold small gatherings in the hotel, inviting staff, neighbors, and even tourists to join in shared meals. We cooked, laughed, sang, and exchanged stories. I noticed how the simple act of participation transformed relationships. I learned to let go of pride, to accept help, and to offer gratitude openly. My boutique hotel, once a symbol of control and status, now represented connection, empathy, and cultural exchange. By the end of the season, I realized that my journey was far from over. I had arrived in the Philippines with wealth, beauty, and ambition, seeking to impose order and elegance. Instead, I had discovered the immeasurable value of human connection, the strength of community, and the wisdom embedded in culture. My staff, once dismissed as inefficient, had become collaborators and teachers. The barangay, once invisible to me, had become my extended family. And in that realization, I found something far richer than I had ever imagined, something money could not buy, no contract could secure, and no plan could achieve. It was the kind of richness that came from understanding, from connection, and from the profound human capacity to give, forgive, and welcome a stranger as one of their own. The months passed in a rhythm I had never imagined for myself. The boutique hotel had transformed from a sterile, pristine project into a living, breathing space where culture, community, and care intertwined. I had stopped thinking like a wealthy Russian outsider and started thinking like a neighbor, a collaborator, a member of the barangay. The values I had observed, the generosity, the Bayanihan spirit, the warmth that transcended wealth, had seeped into my bones. I no longer dictated. I facilitated. I no longer measured success in profit margins alone. I measured it in laughter, in shared meals, in the quiet satisfaction of a guest who felt at home. But life, as I learned in the Philippines, never allowed complacency. One evening, a major supplier called to say that a typhoon had destroyed the road connecting our island to the mainland. Fresh produce, linens, and building materials would not arrive for weeks. Panic fluttered in my chest. I had planned every detail, calculated every contingency, but I had also learned that control was an illusion. I took a deep breath, remembering the lessons of patience, humility, and trust. I turned to my staff, who had become more than employees. They were guides, friends, and family. Together, we assessed the situation. Instead of panicking, we adapted. We reached out to neighbors, asking for local ingredients, borrowed materials, and shared labor. Children ran errands, elders offered advice, and the women prepared communal meals to sustain everyone working tirelessly. I watched in awe as my boutique hotel became a microcosm of the barangay itself, a network of trust, generosity, and cooperation. I rolled up my sleeves alongside them. I carried crates of mangoes from the market. I cleaned rooms with soapy water under the midday sun. I learned to make rice cakes under the patient guidance of my staff. Each task, no matter how menial, became a ritual of connection. I laughed more in these days than I had in years, laughing at mistakes, at my clumsy attempts to learn Tagalog, at the sheer absurdity of my previous notions of control. The typhoon arrived, fierce and relentless. Rain battered the rooftops, wind rattled the windows, and waves crashed against the shore. Guests were frightened, but my staff and now I remained calm. We moved together, securing furniture, helping frightened children, and comforting the elderly. I realized then that true resilience was not about strength alone. It was about the courage to trust others, to rely on community, and to act with empathy in the face of chaos. When the storm finally passed, the hotel and the barangay had weathered it together. Some trees were uprooted, a few roofs damaged, but no life was lost. I walked through the streets with my staff, witnessing the aftermath. Neighbors shared what little they had, offered shelter to those with damaged homes, and laughed despite the destruction. The beauty of this community was not in the perfection of their surroundings, but in the perfection of their hearts. It was then, in that quiet aftermath, that I realized the depth of my transformation. I had come to the Philippines with wealth, beauty, and ambition. I had expected to impose order, elegance, and efficiency. Instead, I had been transformed by patience, humility, and human warmth. I understood now that leadership was not about dictating tasks or firing staff for minor inefficiencies. It was about trust, empathy, and shared purpose. The boutique hotel was no longer mine in the old sense. It belonged to everyone who had poured their heart into it, and I was simply a steward. The next weeks were a celebration of this newfound harmony. We rebuilt what the storm had damaged together. Guests arrived not just to stay in a hotel, but to experience a space alive with community spirit. They joined cooking sessions, attended cultural demonstrations, and witnessed firsthand the extraordinary human connections that sustain this small corner of the Philippines. I became a storyteller, sharing the lessons I had learned about generosity, patience, resilience, and the value of people over profit. I also began to see changes in myself that went beyond the hotel. I smiled without calculation. I listened without judgment. I helped without expectation of reward. I learned that mistakes were not failures. They were opportunities for growth, humor, and connection. My old world, with its cold winters and rigid hierarchies, seemed distant, almost irrelevant. I had discovered a wealth that could not be measured in rubles, a luxury that could not be purchased, the richness of shared humanity. One morning, as the sun rose over the ocean, I stood on the terrace of the hotel and looked out over the barangay. Children were playing in the streets, neighbors greeted each other warmly, and staff prepared breakfast with laughter spilling from the kitchen. I thought back to the day I had fired my first employees, how arrogant and impatient I had been, and I laughed softly to myself. I realized that their forgiveness, their warmth, and their trust had changed me more profoundly than I could have imagined. In that moment, I understood that the boutique hotel was more than a business. It was a living testament to what could happen when cultures met with humility, when strangers became family, and when wealth was used not to control but to empower. The lessons of the Philippines, resilience, generosity, empathy, community, had become a part of me. Years later, I would reflect on that transformation with clarity. The hotel thrived not because of luxury or elegance alone, but because of the human connections that sustained it. The barangay, once invisible to me, had become my extended family. I had learned that leadership was an act of service, that wealth was most powerful when shared, and that happiness was measured not in accounts, but in the hearts we touched. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, I felt a peace I had never known in Moscow's icy streets. The boutique hotel hummed with life, laughter, and warmth. The barangay thrived, not because of my wealth, but because of the shared spirit of care, trust, and love. I had arrived seeking control and comfort, and I had found something far greater: connection, purpose, and a home in the hearts of people who had once seemed so foreign. I understood then that this was the ultimate lesson of my journey. The world could not be tamed with money, influence, or authority alone. It could only be transformed through humility, empathy, and genuine human connection. And in embracing that truth, I had finally come home, not to a city, a hotel, or even a country, but to a way of living that honored both my heart and the hearts of those around me. In the Philippines, I had been fired, humbled, laughed at, challenged, and taught. And in return, I had been embraced, forgiven, and loved. The boutique hotel, the barangay, and I had all found something extraordinary: the enduring power of human connection.